You're listening to Informed Dissent. If you're a longtime listener, welcome back. If you're new, welcome, and here's the lay of the land. I'm Jamie Reed, a lesbian and a whistleblower who worked inside a pediatric gender center. My co-hosts are Lauren Legere, also a lesbian and a longtime LGB advocate. Our other co-host is Corey Cohn, a gay man who underwent gender transition early in his life. All three of us come from the left, and none of us fit the story you've been told about who questions gender medicine. And that's not an accident. Every week, we will cover the headlines you need to know across medicine, law, sports, schools, and prisons. And then we dig in. The three of us, and most weeks, a guest worth hearing from. We built this show because we believe that the most important conversations about gender politics are the ones happening between people with real stakes and real disagreements. Free inquiry, honest argument, and dissent that's worth something because it's actually informed. Welcome.
On this week's Informed Dissent, Jamie Reed sits down with Maya Forstater to discuss all things UK, the conversion therapy bill, the puberty blocker study, and the Amnesty International explosion. Since this was recorded, a few things have developed regarding Amnesty International. The report in question, A Growing Threat, the anti-rights movement in the UK, labeled 51 organizations including Beera's Place, LGB Alliance, For Women Scotland, and Sex Matters as anti-rights. After backlash from figures including J.K. Rowling, Martina Navratilova, and John Cleese, Amnesty UK removed the report and opened an internal review, admitting it was uploaded without going through the organization's own review process. It is not clear if their claim is actually true. Amnesty's global secretariat has since distanced itself from the report entirely, saying it wasn't involved in developing it. Rowling has speculated that Amnesty pulled the report only after seeking legal advice and has pledged to support the organizations libeled in it. This development with Amnesty International feels very similar to the Southern Poverty Law Center's similar attacks here in the United States. Next week, we'll be discussing the puberty blocker trial with James Esses. Maya Forstater came into the gender debate as the claimant in an employment tribunal test case on belief discrimination after she lost her job at the Center for Global Development for tweeting and writing about sex and gender. Her case established that ordinary beliefs about the two sexes are protected under the characteristic of belief in the Equality Act of 2010. Before co-founding Sex Matters, she had 20 years as a researcher, writer, and advisor, working with think tanks and on multi-sector collaborations in business and sustainable development. Her areas of work include international tax policy, climate change, and green finance, and human rights in supply chains, partnering with businesses, NGOs, and the United Nations. She co-founded the Let Toys Be Toys campaign and helped establish the Ethical Trading Initiative. She holds a degree in agriculture. And now, on to the show.
Thank you so much for joining me today on Informed Dissent. For listeners who don't know about your org that you co-founded, Sex Matters, can you share what your org's mission is and what made you personally feel like this was the way to go after the tribunal case?
So we're a registered charity. We have been since 2024. Our mission is campaigning for clarity on sex in law and policy in the UK. So really, really simple. We just think people should be able to say that men are male and women are female, and everything else flows from that. So we are completely non-partisan. We don't represent anyone. We're not avowedly feminist. We're not avowedly anything. We'll work with anybody and everyone who is worthy of respect in a democratic society, which is the thing that I won in my tribunal. The idea that having this, what they said was a belief, and what we said was a belief, uh, is something that is worthy of respect in a democratic society, and therefore you're protected against belief discrimination in the workplace and as a user of services. And that has been really powerful for us as a means of protecting freedom of speech on this particular issue. Uh, and having freedom to talk about it is the first step to being able to unpick the medical injustices, the injustices against women in sport and prisons and refuges and all of those things. So that's what we do. We're quite legally focused, both in terms of bringing cases, intervening in cases, helping people to understand the law and use the law, which doesn't necessarily mean bringing cases, but just helping them to understand the law and, tell their employer, because lots of employers still think you can fire people for saying that men are not women, and dead naming and misgendering and all of that. So helping people to understand and use the law, and then lobbying the government to not pass more bad laws and to make sure that all policies are in line with what we have, which is quite a good law. We have a law that protects women and men against sex discrimination. And then we have the same part of the same law protects transgender people against discrimination on the basis of being transgender. And what the big judgment in the Supreme Court, which we intervened in 2025, what it came out with was that those are two separate protected characteristics, and someone who's transgender shouldn't, they shouldn't be paid less, they shouldn't lose their job, they shouldn't be denied housing or banking, or just all those things that people should get, but it doesn't mean they've changed sex. So the law is now in quite a good place, but policy is still a mess, institutions are a mess, public debate is getting better.
Okay. So you've described, I think, your own path as going from an ordinary mom to a central figure in this debate almost by accident after losing your job. Does that still feel like that, or is this now, have you settled in? Do you feel like this is like the career you didn't expect to have?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm now running an organization. I have a team, staff, we pay tax, we've got regulators, we've got all of that. And we have to do that properly. And we're doing a good thing. And so, I mean, it was sort of by accident, but I was in the right place at the right time to be the person who lost my job. I mean, lots of people lost their job or got bullied out of jobs. Some other people also brought cases, but I was in a position where I had the skills, some of the networks, the location. If you're not in and around London, it's quite hard to engage with Westminster government to do this. And so here I am doing it 5 years later, still going.
So, what I want to do, I think, first is acknowledge and then maybe talk a little bit about the differences between our countries. So, you're in the UK, I'm in the US, and we are in similar yet different trajectories on how these kind of questions are playing out. So, the first one I sort of have is you referenced the 2025 ruling regarding sex, and that sex is a protected category. That is a ruling in a unified system. So that ruling applies to all of the UK.
Not quite. So
Okay.
we're not a federal system. But we've got four nations: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland.
Okay.
And then, but it's not like we have the UK and then the nations. We have things that only apply to England and Wales, and then we have things that only apply to England and Wales and Scotland. Like different kind, education is done one way, health is done another way. It's a mess. So the Equality Act applies to England, Scotland, and Wales. Doesn't apply to Northern Ireland. Northern
Okay.
Ireland has just historically a different set of equality laws that are basically the same but they're in Northern Ireland. And so there's going to be a legal case in Northern Ireland to say, does the Four Winds Scotland, do those principles apply in Northern Ireland? And the interesting thing about that case will be Northern Ireland, is the north part of Ireland. Southern Ireland is a separate country, and Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is still part of Europe. And so when the UK left the EU, part of that deal was that people in Northern Ireland are still guaranteed to have all the rights that they would have had if we'd stayed in the EU. And so the question about whether Form in Scotland applies in Northern Ireland will have repercussions for whether woman means female all over the EU. So it's kind of it's messy.
When is that case? Is that moving forward?
It is slowly. That's a case that's been started by the equality regulator in Northern Ireland, who basically want to go to their courts and say, tell us what the law is, which is a bit odd because the equality regulator ought to be able to tell people what the law is, but they're asking the courts to tell them. So yeah, it's not like, it's not a federal system. We don't have, dozens and dozens of states. We've got four, and it's a little bit messy, but it does mean the Equality Act, that covers the whole of England, Scotland, and Wales.
Okay. Okay. Another difference between the US and the UK is in our health insurance or our healthcare systems, how they are distributing or putting forward healthcare. So you had the CAS review, which was a government commissioned evidence-based review that was kind of meant to reshape NHS policy. We don't have that equivalent. We had our HHS review, but it doesn't drive policy. Do you see right now that UK model, is it working? Is it what I heard you say a little bit ago is that we're getting good legal decisions, but then how that becomes policy seems like a really tricky point.
Yeah, so the CAS review was commissioned by NHS England, so it applied just to England, and she looked at the evidence and she said that there's no good evidence for puberty blockers, and as a result of that, the government banned puberty blockers for under 18s. That was the previous government, and then this government continued the ban, but they had right from the beginning in that they had apart from as part of a medical trial. So they right from the beginning they kind of built in the option of a medical trial, and then recently they've banned cross-sex hormones for under 18. So that is a big lever that the government can pull, and they did. And so within the NHS and legitimate medical treatment, you now can't do those things, but kids are still getting drugs on the internet. They're using different different treatments than the puberty blockers that are banned. So it's not perfect, but it is quite centralized with quite a large degree of control. But then obviously they're now saying they're going to start the puberty blockers trial.
Yeah. We're going to come back to that in just a minute because I want to ask you one like giant opinion question first. So, where you sit right now, is the UK ahead of the US on our core issues, behind it? Or are we like are we like playing two different sports? Like, where are we at?
I don't know. I mean, there were definitely big steps forward with President Trump's is it directives that you
Yeah.
sign,
Yes.
and we looked at those and we thought they're really good and clear. We could have written that. But they can be changed by the next government.
I can.
So that there's that. Whereas if you do something and it's passed through Parliament and it goes through the courts, it's much harder to have that kind of flip-flop back and forwards. But I think we are kind of helping each other. I mean, definitely, the CAS review broke the thing open, but the HHS review is much better. There's more to it. They
Yeah.
looked more seriously at um, there were just more studies and there's more to it. And they thought more about social transition, whereas Hilary Cass, she had a mandate which was about the clinics, and she really didn't think about social transition. She kind of took that as a given. Um, and then things like the ruling, the Supreme Court ruling you just had about Title
Sport.
IX.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
that was great. And we, Sex Matters, put in a amicus brief to that. And um, it just feels like kind of things that are happening here are helping to bring clarity there. And hopefully we'll get back to sanity one day.
So let's talk about a current bill. And this is where, if I get the language incorrect, because our systems are different, correct me.
Mhm.
But your government has published a draft conversion practices bill. And if I understand it, it would criminalize what's called abusive acts aimed at changing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity
Mhm.
with penalties, is this correct? Up to 5 years in prison?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. And that this bill could actually target parents?
Yep, they've said any act. There's a carve out for medical treatment, but there's no carve out for parents.
Okay. So Sex Matters as an organization, I believe, is concerned with this bill as it is drafted.
Absolutely.
Where is this bill at? Is this been introduced in Parliament? Now they debate it and then they vote? How does that work?
So, I mean, government in the UK has been promising to bring this bill for like 5 years, 4 or 5 years. The previous government promised to bring this bill and failed, and it's a nightmare. This government has brought this bill, but they brought it on the slow track. So what they've done is they published the draft bill for legislative scrutiny, and that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, like you say, they can just publish a bill, go straight into the House of Commons, they debate it, goes through the stages, and it gets
Okay.
passed. But instead of doing that, they've gone for a slower track, which is publish it, have a joint committee, so a joint committee of the House of Commons and the House of Lords that will look at the bill and debate it and take evidence and do all of that. And then as a result of that, they will publish a report, and then the draft bill will be updated, changed, and then the government will let send it to Parliament, and then you go through all the debate. So it's on the slow track, which suggests they know it's problematic. And
So, okay, so then does that mean are they open to an org like your org or LGB Alliance? Are they seeking input? Is that where they're at right now?
well, they will have to. I mean, they can't turn people away who have evidence. And so at the moment, what they're doing is they've got to work out which MPs and which lords are on the joint committee, and then that joint committee will um, work out a schedule and call for evidence and call people to come and you know, give evidence in person or written evidence. Um, so that yeah, that's where it's at. I mean, I'm not saying they're desperately happy to have input from Sex Matters, but they can't say no.
Do you feel like I've read some posts on X that are saying things like, this is a bill to save Stonewall. This is a bill that is like the back door to keep transition alive. Who was this bill
Yeah,
created
it
for?
it does feel like that. I mean, conversion therapy bills are happening all over the place. I mean, not everywhere, but there is this international move on it. Um, when we looked at uh, the kind of trans rights organizations and Stonewall, they were LGB organizations before, they weren't talking about conversion therapy like 10 years ago. And if you think about it, most people think conversion therapy is like electric shocks to the genitals and, giving people stuff that makes them vomit and locking them in rooms and, violent and abusive, coercive processes. And, um, that doesn't happen. That things like that happened in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. That doesn't happen. 10 years ago, LGB and LGBT organizations were not talking about conversion therapy at all as an issue. And then they lost the battle for gender self ID. So they wanted to bring in gender self ID. The kind of gender critical resistance movement formed, and they lost on that. And it was at that time that they then started talking about conversion therapy. And it's like a marketing trick, I think, to say, because it's it's promoted as being, this is like torture. And so what they're asking you is, do you want to torture gay children? And most people say, no, no, of course I don't. And they go, aha, well, you're against conversion therapy. And so it's very hard for people to stand up and say, no, you shouldn't legislate on this, because they've done this bait and switch between the kind of real abusive conversion therapy, which isn't happening. And even if it was, it would be unlawful, it would be assault, it would be, corrective rape is rape, and so on. Um, so that, there's this kind of bogeyman picture in people's heads, and what the law will actually target, which is parents saying to kids, you know, take your time. Maybe maybe you're just gay, maybe you're not a girl, maybe um, just take time to grow up, or all of that. Um, so it's terrifying.
In your sort of process, is this a bill that could see enough changes that there could be maybe a consensus created, or is
I
it fundamentally just kind of flawed from its inception?
I think it's flawed, because I think they haven't been able to show that there is a problem that needs a new law.
Okay.
So they haven't shown that there is actually this set of abusive conversion practices that aren't already unlawful that need to be um, criminalized.
Could they just drop it then? If there's enough public pushback, could they
They
just
could,
say,
they could, and we're going to have a new prime minister, not a new government, new prime minister, because this one's um, been pushed. So we'll have new, same party, new prime minister.
okay,
He may have different priorities. Who knows? But as you say, it is the bill to save Stonewall, because what it will do is, if it comes in, um, there's both an offence for individuals doing conversion therapy, and there's an offence for organisations assisting conversion therapy. And
uh,
because the offence is drawn so widely, you're then going to have organisations going, well, how do we know that we're not doing it? Are we taking all reasonable steps in the same way you do with like anti-money laundering and
yeah,
anti-fraud? You have to make sure that your organisation isn't doing those things or allowing those things to happen by accident. So then you need someone to come in and train you and tell you what conversion therapy is, and charge you some money, and then you can
okay,
see how this is
yep,
Stonewall's way
yep,
back into institutions.
okay, I gotcha. Okay. Um, while we're talking about institutions for a moment, I'm gonna pivot over. Um, so I want to talk about Amnesty International for a minute. Um, so I have to confess right off the bat, I have an Amnesty International tattoo. It was the first tattoo I ever got. I
Oh
was,
yeah.
yeah, 17 or 18. Um, I was an Amnesty International chapter lead all through high school, into college. Um, Amnesty International, the way I used to understand it, was an international human rights organization that used to promote um, and fight against human rights abuses through letter writing campaigns,
Mm,
mostly that people would learn about somebody who is maybe imprisoned for their beliefs, or lost their job for their
yeah.
beliefs, sounds familiar. And they would promote letter writing campaigns to bring light to that individual's plight. Amnesty International UK just put out a report this week.
Mm-hmm.
They titled the report "A Growing Threat: The Anti-Rights Movement in the UK." And they named Sex Matters directly. And they also named LGBT Alliance. And is it Philia?
Yeah.
So,
And GenSpect and CanSG. So all of the gender critical, the sort of bigger gender critical organizations, and also all of the little small ones. There are, groups of doctors and teachers and civil servants, and they named all of those groups.
did you in a million years ever think that you would end up in this position?
Um, Amnesty's been going bad for quite a long time. I mean, I came out of the international NGO sector. I was working for a international development NGO before I lost my job, and the first thing I wrote about this topic was about why sex matters in international development. You think about maternal mortality, you know, refugee camps, women's particular vulnerability. And I put in that thing, Amnesty had stuff about in refugee camps, you have to think about single sex spaces for women. And,
Yeah.
and so I said, like, on one hand, internationally, they're thinking about men and women in a normal way. And on the other hand, they have for many years now run with "you are who you say you are, you're a bigot if you disagree," and all of that. So, I mean, this latest report from Amnesty didn't come as a huge shock, but it's just ridiculous.
Did they reach out to you in advance and say, "We're
No,
going to name you? Would you like to provide evidence? Would you like to discuss your position?"
no, nothing like that. I mean, I'm going to write to them and say, we'd like to come and talk. I mean, we are a human rights charity. We're registered, recognized by the government as working for the public good in the same way that Amnesty is. Um, we have quite similar charitable objects, the things that we're legally obliged to do, which is promote human rights, promote understanding of the law. Same thing that Amnesty's doing on paper, but we think they've completely gone off the rails.
Are charities supposed to attack one another? Like,
They can. I mean, they're I mean, they can disagree. You can have charities that are pro-life and you can have charities that are pro-choice. You can have, all kinds of religious
okay,
beliefs. You can disagree on lots of things. They aren't supposed to, they're supposed to conduct themselves in a way that's not um, kind of tabloidy. That's
okay,
but
yeah.
there's no real regulation that they do. So I'll write to them and see if I can get a meeting. And because we're a charity, we go to like charity things and we see these people and we say hi. Can we talk to you about sex-based rights? And um, it's I don't know. I think Amnesty has gone so far down this rabbit hole. I don't think they're coming back. I think they've just bought into this "you are who you say you are" thing. Um, and they've become quite authoritarian. I mean,
I was
the
gonna
the
say, do they see any of the fact that what they're claiming is essentially that they're claiming that you represent an anti-rights
Mm,
organization. But in doing and in saying that, they're essentially silencing or saying that there are certain beliefs or opinions that should be
yeah,
silenced.
and I mean they intervened in the Four Women Scotland case. We did, and they did, and the lesbians did, um, and so they put their best arguments forward as to why the law should work or the law works in the way that they thought it worked. And the Supreme Court wasn't convinced at all. And the Supreme Court went with us. And so now they're finding themselves in a position where they're arguing against the Equality Act, which is a very difficult position for them to be in because they're an employer. They're still, there will be gender critical people in Amnesty International and they can't discriminate against them. And I think it's very difficult for a human rights charity to stand up and say we're against the Equality Act. But that's where they are now. That's where Stonewall is now. It's an odd position to find themselves in, but that's the kind of hole they've dug. Um,
Okay, another kind of follow-up question here about part of Amnesty's report. So, what I keep seeing in the criticisms of I'll just use the phrase gender critical movement, what they're criticizing is that there is coordination between our groups. So that's one criticism, is that we coordinate, we know each other, we're friends, we talk to one another. I have to just believe that when we think of the other side, there is no way that they are not coordinated,
of
talk to like
course, of
I don't
course.
really understand that as a criticism. And then the other thing that they're saying is that we are coordinated. And now the other thing is that we are well resourced. This was
Mm.
about money. Are they mad? Are they trying to put people on notice? Look, there's some donors now stepping up for these orgs. Are they trying to scare people away
Well,
from donating?
I mean, I think um, it took them a while to even notice us. Like the original narrative they had was there's the religious right, and the religious right. I mean, if you look at their charts, there is more money in the big religious
Yes.
organizations,
Yes.
and that was there's a whole EU supported narrative about anti gender organizations. And so that was the narrative they brought out for years and years. And they almost didn't notice that there was this other group that isn't that well resourced, that isn't particularly right wing, that isn't particularly religious, of angry middle-aged women basically. And so now they've kind of gone, oh god, yeah, okay, we've got
And
to.
the gays and the
And
lesbians.
yes,
Or yes.
and the
Yes.
gays and the lesbians. We've got to acknowledge that that part of the debate exists. So they put the two of them together, and so most of the organisations they're counting are pregnancy choice organisations. And I think I mean, in a democratic society, people have different views about these things. People should be able to donate to what they like and set up charities they like and do what they want and argue your point. But they're kind of demonizing the whole of that and including the whole of Gender Critical Inc. And trying to say we're terribly well resourced. When we're operating on a shoestring.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Sex Matters has shown in Amnesty's report, if it was correct, there has been some growth in funding over the past few years. Um, do you feel like you are starting to get some fiscal support? Is it what people assume? Does the funding picture tell us that there is maybe more of a grassroots groundswell of support that's out there?
I mean, we we started out with no money at all. Someone gave us £3,000 and we set up a website and we launched on the day. I mean, it took us a little while to launch, but we basically launched on the day when I won my employment appeal tribunal. And we had this idea that if we could ask people to give us £5 a month, £10 a month, or £30 a month, we'd get enough to get started. And so that's how we got started, and that's still the kind of bedrock of our funding that allowed me to get a salary. And we employed an administrator and got a little bit of a team, and then we have found other people with kind of bigger chunks of money to give us, but we haven't got a single backer. We're not bankrolled by JK Rowling. JK Rowling decided to do something different, which I think is great. So what she decided to do, she's done two things. One, she set up Byra's Place in Edinburgh, which is a rape crisis centre for women. Like, that's a revolution, because the rape crisis centre in Edinburgh was run by a man. identifying as a woman. So she set up rape crisis centers. She bought the building. She's kind of completely funding and running that. And then the other thing she set up was the J.K. Rowling Fund for Women, which supports individual women and and organizations in some cases to bring cases. So if you have a case, a discrimination case, or a case where you're not able to access a single sex service because public authority is saying it's a women's service and allowing in trans-identified men, she'll support those cases. So she's not bankrolling Sex Matters, but she is putting, we don't know how much, but generous amount into quite a serious targeted thing to say, if you've got a good case, you can apply, and the criteria are open, you can see how to apply, and they consider them and fund some of those cases.
So it sounds very similar to here in the US, though. So grassroots base, that £5, that £10, to me, that represents um, maybe a woman who's on her retirement salary. She is seeing that this is an issue that she wants to contribute to, or dads or families.
Yeah.
Do you think part of their target right now, though, is something we say here is that we've been punching above our weight class?
Mm-hmm.
I think there was a line in their report where it basically was acknowledging, like, you're being successful.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean,
remarkably successful, they
yeah.
said. Um, I mean, we have a joke in Sex Matters about uh our gigantic infrastructure. Like when we very first started, we had we put an event on for lawyers, and we ran it with volunteers, and half of us have been on the PTA, and we've done all kinds of previous jobs, and we're just like good at organizing things. And so we organized this event, and it got noticed on X, and somebody said this new vast infrastructure has emerged, like it had to be funded by somebody else, not just a bunch of middle-aged women who are good at organizing things and who are very angry and who've been paying a lot of attention to this. So I think I think Amnesty doesn't really understand that. And the other thing is the other side don't listen to us. I think they've just demonized us so much that they think we are such awful, terrible people. I don't know. I mean, maybe they are listening to the podcast and getting some decent intelligence, but I think um, they just don't listen to our arguments. They don't pay particular attention to what we're doing. They think we are, you know, funded by this dark money rather than funded by anger and, as you say, individuals putting in £5 and £10 a month. We get people who give us, who sign up as supporters, and that's brilliant. It's the absolute bedrock of Sex Matters. And then we notice there are also people who will give us money once or twice a year. And I think and I've talked to some of them, what they're doing is they've budgeted, I'm going to give money each month to a different, sometimes to a legal case, sometimes to something in the US, sometimes something in Australia. So, it's like there's a ecosystem of people figuring out how can we try and shift this system. And there are a lot of people who can't say anything at work yet, even though they have the protection. They can't say anything at work, but one thing they can do is donate where they can do it, anonymously, and they know that their money is going to be used by organizations that are making a difference.
Yeah. I don't know why I felt myself tearing up there thinking about
It,
there are a lot of it, who can't speak up. They can't speak up, maybe
mm,
not at their jobs, but also maybe in their own family. They have an affected kid or they have a
yeah,
family member and they want to do whatever they can to help. And what I think is really critical is them knowing that that £5 a month is make it or break it for orgs like yours and
yeah,
folks like mine.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to talk about the puberty blocker trial. We are going to have James Esses.
yeah.
Um, his episode will air after yours, and I know he's going to dive into this a little bit deeper and in a different way too. But we here in the US are concerned. I think that we see a lot of people on X who just are saying things like, wanted this to not go forward, but it sounds like we're at the point, is this going to happen?
Well, James and Keira Bell and the Bayswater parents have a judicial review against it. So that they're at the judicial review is where you ask the court to decide whether something that a public body is doing is lawful or not. And the first stage of a judicial review is you have to get permission. So it's sort of they have to decide whether there's a case to answer, whether there's enough of a case to answer. That's the stage they're at right now, is the permission stage. Then if they get permission, then the court will consider all of the legal arguments put before them by the Bayswater group, James S's group, all of the health regulator, the King's College London, who's running the study, the Department of Health and Social Care. Sex Matters is applying to intervene. We heard that Gendered Intelligence, one of the trans rights organisations, is also intending to apply to intervene. So that there are legal arguments to play out. But if
Well, can I interrupt to ask for a question? I have not heard, are there trans rights organizations in the UK who are in support of this? Because I often feel like they would be not in support of requiring a trial.
there are different views.
Okay.
But yeah, the Gendered Intelligence, which has been around for quite a long time pushing this, were there in court and said that they
Okay.
were considering intervening.
Okay. So what I understand is that the trial is set to resume August 1st, which is quite soon. That there was some change to the minimum ages. So I think it's 11 for girls who identify as trans and 12 for boys who identify as trans. It was paused in February. If this moves forward, is there going to be, let me think about how to phrase this. There was supposed to be a trial at Tavistock when the blockers first rolled. Is there a lot of public, if this goes and starts, I feel like you're going to keep the pressure up that it's transparent, that they publish their data, that they don't lose it again. Is that kind of pivot strategy? If this is going to happen, are you going to make sure it happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's true both of the conversion therapy bill and the puberty blockers trial. None of this stuff is going to happen in the dark in the way that it did 15 years ago. There's just too much attention on it, too many organized groups, holding the government to account on this. So yeah, they certainly won't be able to do it in the way that they did at the Tavistock. But they did say in the ethics review of this trial, one of the questions that the ethics review asked was, what will you do if you reach the number of, because currently the only way to legally get puberty blockers for gender issues in the UK is through the trial, and there's a 227, I think, is their target. And they said, what if you reach that number and there's still demand? And they said, oh well, we'll probably try and extend it, which is exactly what happened at the Tavistock. They said they were doing a trial and then they just never stopped. So I mean, this one, they're saying very few children will get it. They all have to go through an in-depth psychological assessment. It's only going to be 5% of the children in the overall study who are going to be put on puberty blockers. They have this idea that they can work out who are the right children to be given this. But the experience of the Tavistock was once you started giving them out, you create the demand for it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you have any sense that the general public, like the UK random person on the street that doesn't follow this, do you have any sense that there might be support for this to go forward to get some sort of definitive answer that the public just wants clarity once and for all?
I'm not sure that people are that much in the weeds about the trial. I mean, I think there's definitely a kind of um, doctor knows best and the scientists know best, and who's going to argue with the scientists. But in general, I think people think about pediatric transition that they're too young. That's the answer that we get from people. There's just a general answer that children are too young to do this, and experimenting on children is bad. That's the general view. But then there's also a lot of people, will have a child in school with kids who are trans identifying, and it has become the norm, and they may not feel able to say what they think anyway if their kids have been told that you have to be kind.
Okay, that makes total sense. Okay. Um, I have just a couple questions to wrap up. So, for listeners and for us outside of the UK, we're trying to follow basically a lot of the threads coming out of the UK all at once. You're kind of a fire hose sometimes that we try to
Tell me about it.
what, if you could predict, what do you think we should be paying attention to, focusing on for the rest of 2026 coming out of the UK? And then do you have some predictions for the next couple years?
Um, so
Big questions. Just tell us
yeah,
the future.
big questions. I mean, the two big things happening on the legal front right now in the UK is one, after the Forum in Scotland judgment, everyone said we're waiting for the guidance. So they were waiting for this statutory guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which doesn't change the law, but has case studies and stuff in it. People have been using it as an excuse not to act. We've just come to the end of the 40-day period that it was published. It had to be laid before Parliament for 40 days. It's now up to the government to put a statutory instrument into Parliament. So basically, kind of stamp it. Doesn't get debated or anything like that. Just gets stamped, and then it would become a live regulation that employers and service providers have to use. And I think that's a kind of event horizon. They won't be able to say we're waiting for the guidance anymore. They'll probably come up with some other excuse, but that's going to tip quite a lot of organisations to get their single sex services stuff in order. And then the other big thing that's happened, and this is just in England at the moment, this kind of, we have four nations, is the statutory safeguarding guidance. So safeguarding is what the word that we use for like child protection, the whole overall system of child protection. And there is statutory guidance for schools, whether they're state schools or private schools of every age, about the whole of safeguarding. Like, what do you do if you have a concern about a child that they may be being neglected or harmed in school, out of school, by their peers, by adults, the whole thing. And it's part of the school inspection system. And they've just put a whole bunch of stuff in there about gender questioning kids, and also about toilets and changing rooms. So they've said that you cannot promise any child that they can use opposite sex toilets at any point in their school career. You cannot promise that they can use opposite sex changing rooms. They can't. The sport thing is a little bit more hedged around. They basically say if there's separate sex sport for safety, like you're playing rugby or soccer, then if it's safety, then it's definitely, you have to keep it separate sex. If it's fairness, they kind of hedge it around a little bit, but they pretty much say there are two sexes, children can't change sex. And it also says you can't record a child, because schools are rules based, very regulated institutions. And one of the things is, when a child joins the school, you register them, and there are certain details that you have to register. And one of them is their sex. And they say you cannot change a child's sex on the register. And then they say, but what if a child wants to socially transition? We've got to think about this and think about that and the best interest of the child. But they've already ruled out changing the records, allowing them to use opposite sex facilities, allowing them to play opposite sex sports. So there's not really a lot left. And that's going to be a big shift. So those two bits of policy are kind of coming online in September. So I think we'll then see quite a lot of institutions responding to that. And that whole thing about what can children expect to do in school then feeds back to this question of the what can the clinicians promise them, because clinicians have never thought about other people's rights. They only ever thought, what can I do for this child in front of me? And they didn't think, you know, can I promise this child that if they have this treatment, they can live as the opposite sex? They could they never had the ability to promise them that. And that's now becoming clearer in the school's guidance.
You just, I think, nailed that so well. I often try to talk about how there's this medical intervention, but what it leads to is it leads to a collision of rights.
Mm,
And how we as a society recognize you can't do this thing without it directly becoming a collision of and a
yeah,
takeaway of the rights of women and children and that impact. I mean,
yeah.
it leads
And,
directly to that.
and one of the benefits that they're trying to say from the puberty blockers trial is this is going to help these kids to get on better at school and with their peers. And it's like, no, you're setting them up on a collision course with their school's rules and behavior
Yeah,
policies, which are there to protect all the kids.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so where can our listeners find you? And then I think we'll have to have you back in September, October as all of these things start to flow forward.
Yeah, that
Are
would
you
be good.
on X? You're on X. You're
Yeah,
on
I'm on X. I've been on X for 10
a very long
years. It
time.
is far too much of my life.
And Sex Matters
So
is
Sex Matters is at sex-matters.org. We have podcast that goes out every Friday. We have a newsletter. I mean, it's very UK focused, but if you want to know what's going on in the UK, you can sign up to our newsletter. If you want to support us, we accept donations from all over the world. Um, and I'd be delighted to come back.
Thank you so much for joining us today and bringing us all of these excellent updates from the UK.
Thank you.
This podcast is produced by the LGB Courage Coalition, a registered United States nonprofit fully funded by small donations like yours. We work to promote evidence-based medicine, ending the medicalization of gender nonconformity, and advocating for LGB rights. Supporting this show means supporting that work directly. If what you heard today mattered to you, please like, subscribe, and pass it along. Word of mouth is how independent shows like this one survive. You can reach us in the Substack comments section or by email at lgbcouragecoalition@gmail.com or through the contact page on our website at lgbcourage.org. We want to hear from you. And until next week, stay informed and ready to dissent.